Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, despite the firm opposition of the visiting King of Jordan and other leaders of Arab nations, President Donald Trump once again states his plan for the US to take over Gaza and for displaced Palestinians to be housed in Jordan and Egypt. Israel and the United States tell Hamas to release hostages this weekend or face a return to war, leaving mediators scrambling to salvage the Gaza ceasefire deal. Also coming up, we're going to be speaking to Scotland's former First Minister Humza Yousaf, whose in-laws were trapped in Gaza at the start of the Israeli invasion. We'll be getting his reaction to the latest proposals regarding the future of the Palestinian territory. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President Donald Trump has reiterated his plan to take over the Gaza Strip, and he did so on Tuesday in the presence of the visiting King Abdullah of Jordan at the White House. Well, this was their first meeting since President Trump announced his proposal to take over the territory and move its 2 million Palestinians to other countries, amongst them Jordan.
And with the United States being in control of that piece of land, a fairly large piece of land, you can have stability in the Middle East for the first time. And the Palestinians, or the people that live now in Gaza, will be living beautifully in another location. They're going to be living safely. They're not going to be killed, murdered, and having to leave every 10 years, because I've been watching this for so many years. It's nothing but trouble.
The US President speaking there. Well, Jordan's King Abdullah II has announced that his country will take in 2,000 sick children from Gaza in an effort to ease US President Donald Trump's pressure on Jordan to accept Palestinian refugees. Well, when asked by reporters if Jordan was prepared to take in more Palestinians from Gaza, King Abdullah refrained from answering directly. Instead, he pointed to Egypt's broader international standing, which aligns with the two-state solution. Egypt, which the White House has also engaged, is expected to present proposals in response to President Trump's plan on behalf of the Arab League. Well, President Trump has stated, though, he is 99% certain he will reach an agreement with Cairo.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the president is looking at Egypt coming to present their plan. As I said, we will be in Saudi Arabia to discuss how we can work with the president and with the United States. So I think let's wait until the Egyptians can come and present it to the president and not get ahead of ourselves.
Well, for more, we can speak now to Thomas Pickering, who is the former US ambassador to Jordan. Ambassador Pickering, it's great to have you with us again here on Al Arabiya News. You know King Abdullah of Jordan. You've known him from even the days when he was the Crown Prince of Jordan before he became king. I expect you were watching the developments at the White House on Tuesday evening. Have you ever seen him looking quite so uncomfortable?
I don't know that it was the most pleasant experience that he could have undergone, but I thought that he handled it with control, with clear determination, and with a sense that he wanted to get through that particular episode, if I could call it that, without risking American support, which is very significant financially for Jordan on the one hand, or the reputation that he has developed in the Arab world of sticking with the general consensus of Arab views, and that meant not accepting to buy into the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza, which is a primary preoccupation of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli right wing, and happens to be contrary to international law, among other things. And I thought his idea of welcoming 2,000 injured, sick, disabled, otherwise children from Gaza for treatment in Jordan was a sensible, honest, and decent thing to do in a useful way to come in the direction of what people were asking him to do without putting himself in the difficulties that I just outlined.
I mean, do you think he managed to get across Jordan's point of view to President Trump? And do you think we're likely to get any indication that President Trump is going to have a rethink about this, this plan for Gaza?
Yes and no are my answers to your questions. It would be difficult for President Trump to ignore what he had to say. And I don't know what he said in the private meeting, but what he had to say in the public meeting was a gentle conveyance of a determination that I thought was real. And from my knowledge of Crown Prince Abdullah, now King Abdullah, I thought that was very straightforward. But in the long record of the kind of politeness and the kind of dignity and respect which the Hashemite rulers of Jordan have exhibited in their long periods of rule in the countries concerned. They may be criticized on other grounds, but I find it hard to see that people can lay a hand on them, so to speak, with respect to those particular assets and attributes of respect and dignity that are part of a good behavior pattern in their part of the world.
Indeed. And I mean, we heard President Trump saying that King Abdullah and President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt would, quote, come around to his idea. I mean, knowing King Abdullah as you do, I mean, how do you think it goes down with him to hear from the US president that he will come around to this way of thinking? I mean, it's not exactly
we have all gotten
language.
used to President Trump's way of speaking and understand what it means and understand that it is part of his negotiating tactics in terms of seeking to find an answer to a problem which is not working out to his advantage, which he can find a way to turn in that direction. In diplomacy, we call it creating negotiating leverage, and it can take many forms.
One of the other things President Trump said is, I believe we've got a parcel of land in Jordan. I believe we've got a parcel of land in Egypt. What's he talking about?
I don't know. Well, I think that he has been suggesting for some time, point one, that the people of Gaza be moved to Egypt and to Jordan. He's a real estate entrepreneur of significant reputation. To move people, you have to have land. To get land, you have to have acquiescence of the government. He is making a statement that I think he hoped would be accepted in a public way. It was not, but it was not rejected in a public way, which puts him in the middle. And he had enough good sense at that particular point in the conversation, I think, not to try to make a scapegoat or a victim or indeed an undignified approach himself to King Abdullah, who had been treating him with dignity and respect throughout the conversation.
Yeah, when you hear President Trump saying that this idea of taking control of Gaza and turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East, he says this plan is going to bring peace to the region. As someone who knows the region, do you agree with that assessment?
I don't think so. And in my last interview with you, I foreshadowed that this was coming because it's been apparent that it is a preoccupation of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the people who support him. And his particular political position is at risk under current circumstances, and everything he can deliver to his supporters, either via President Trump or from President Trump to President Sisi or King Abdullah, is something that's useful in his being able to manage continued leadership in Israel, and incidentally, in that fashion, stay away from the pending look by the Israeli political system at the concerns and failures of their intelligence establishment, and indeed of their military posture that led to the unfortunate and deadly successful attack of Hamas in southern Israel on October 7th.
Some people have said that this plan to relocate Gazan civilians in Jordan and in Egypt would threaten the survival of Jordan. And as someone who served there as US ambassador, I just wonder if you could tell us why people are saying that and whether or not you agree with it.
Well, I think in part that's based on the data that Jordan now has in its population, a majority. I don't know the exact figures of citizens of Jordan whose origin is in Palestine to the west of Jordan and who have mainly come as refugees from the conflicts beginning with Israel's War of Independence in 1948, but following on. And that particular number of people would be close to being increased by a very significant percentage if 2.3 million people from Gaza are in one way or another pushed out, a large percentage of whom apparently, in the eyes at least of Prime Minister Netanyahu and maybe President Trump, would be destined for Jordan. And so Jordan would assume an absolute majority of Palestinian refugees among its population. Jordan has, for years, under the leadership of King Abdullah's father, granted citizenship to Palestinian refugees, something that I believe is extremely rare in the rest of the Arab world, if not non-existent. And in doing so, they have rights to participate in political decision-making in the electoral processes that take place in Jordan, mainly through the election of legislative representatives to the Jordanian parliament.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm told we're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. The former US ambassador to Jordan, Thomas Pickering. Thanks as ever.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, in tandem with President Trump's message, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has set a deadline for Hamas to release all hostages still being held in Gaza by midday on Saturday. He has warned that the alternative would be an end to the ceasefire and a resumption of military activity.
In light of Hamas's announcement of its decision to violate the agreement and not release our hostages, last night I ordered the military to gather forces inside and around the Gaza Strip. This operation is being carried out at this time. It will be completed in the very near future. If Hamas does not return our hostages by Saturday noon, the ceasefire will end, and the military will return to intense fighting until Hamas is finally defeated.
The Israeli Prime Minister speaking there. Well, we can speak now to Itamar Rabinovich, former Israeli ambassador to the United States and former chief negotiator to Syria. Ambassador, great to have you with us once again on Al Arabiya News. Mediators are working hard to try and save the ceasefire deal for Gaza. Can it be saved, or is it going to collapse?
I think it can be saved, and the fact that Hamas issued its ultimatum early in the week indicates to me that they wanted to give it enough time to be settled before the deadline of the weekend. So my sense is that it is doable.
Okay, and if all the hostages are returned in line with that demand, what's the next step? What does Israel do then?
No, the actual Israeli demand is for the 3 hostages designated to be returned over the weekend to be returned. Israel also indicated that it wanted all hostages to be returned in a final deal, and that is because this is a demand presented by President Trump, and clearly the Israeli government could not seem less patriotic than Mr. Trump.
Okay, so President Trump, as we've heard, has said that hell would break loose, or words to that effect, if all the hostages are not returned by midday on Saturday. I mean, what are we talking here? What does all hell break loose mean?
It's unfortunately, it's a pretty vague threat. President Trump also said that no American money would be spent and no American soldiers would be sent. So who is to wreak hell on Hamas? Obviously, what he means is that he would not curtail any Israeli activities, but we Israelis are not really interested in going back to the war. I think we want to end the war, not to give it a new push. So the whole set of pronouncements by President Trump over this issue are a bit problematic.
Problematic because hasn't he slightly shot himself in the foot, in the sense that this deal, which was achieved after a great deal of effort over several months, not least during the transition period between the two presidencies in the United States, now looks like it's been, it's in a state of confusion. It's no longer the clear deal that it was. Is that what you mean?
More than that. I mean, first of all, that deal took a long time to negotiate, and it's not a perfect deal. It has quite a few deficiencies, and actually changing the deal or improving the deal may not be such a bad idea. But the problem goes deeper than that, because President Trump's pronouncements, to begin with, presented two old, well-established allies of the United States, namely Jordan and Egypt, in a very awkward position. We could see the King of Jordan during his visit to the White House and how awkward he felt at the time, because neither Jordan nor Egypt wants to take a large number of Palestinians from Gaza into their territory. It would run counter to what we can call the Arab consensus, would present them with a huge problem with their own populations. So President Trump has put two old American allies in a very awkward position. And secondly, he has played into the hands of the extreme messianic right wing in Israel, because they now feel that, well, if President Trump is on our side, let's push it. Let's continue the war. Let's establish settlements in Gaza. These are the voices you hear from the messianic Israeli right that feels that the wind that President Trump put in their sails is working in their favor.
Indeed, and your Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has called Donald Trump's relocation plan, quote, revolutionary. And I'm just wondering, aside from the far-right elements that you just described there, how widely shared is that opinion, do you think, in Israel?
No, there is a strong right wing, of which Mr. Netanyahu himself is part. There are radical right-wingers in his own party, in his coalition. Not everybody is messianic and extremist, but there are right-wingers, quite a few. But since Mr. Trump became president of the United States, the rules of the game in American and international politics seem to have changed, at least for now. And everybody wants to please Mr. Trump. Everybody is afraid of Mr. Trump. And everybody wants to flatter Mr. Trump. So if President Trump, during a meeting with Netanyahu, surprises him with this revolutionary off-the-cuff presentation, then the Prime Minister of Israel has to join in and praise it and play by the new rules of the game in international politics.
And what are we hearing from the families of the hostages still being held in Gaza? They must be extremely concerned that deal to release them is in jeopardy.
First of all, the families of the hostages who are going to be released as part of the current phase of the deal. And then, of course, those who have to wait for further negotiations. So all are concerned that these, call it exercises in diplomacy, could cost the lives of their beloved.
And you alluded to the fact that this idea was an off-the-cuff plan. I just want to get your sort of a little bit more detail on what you really think of the plan. Some have called it reckless, some have called it provocative, some have called this plan for Gaza half-baked and unworkable. What do you think?
Unworkable is the right term because, first of all, the whole idea of transferring 2 million people out of Gaza to where? Which country would want to absorb these Palestinians from Gaza? And secondly, we know that this statement was not preceded by the normal staff work that you have in the normal conduct of foreign policy. Normally, if the president has such an idea, and then a couple of days before the meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel, this normally should be presented to the National Security Council and to other professional staff, get their feedback. And I'm sure many of them would have said that it's not workable and makes no point. But we know, the second term is still fresh, but we had Trump for a full term. And we know that part of his style is to present a very radical idea in order to settle on something more moderate. This happened several times. So if it all ends up by the Arab world rallying to the cause and presenting a workable plan to rehabilitate Gaza and to put a normal government, not a Hamas government, in place, then the end result could be positive, but we're not there yet.
The Israeli Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, said shortly after President Donald Trump won the election that 2025 was going to be the year of, quote, sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. He's referring to the West Bank. I mean, is there a feeling, do you think, in Israel that perhaps the West Bank, with rising tensions, could be the next arena for a very serious conflict?
Well, there is violence in the West Bank as while we are speaking now. Mr. Smotrich belongs to the camp or the faction that I described as messianic right wing. He has long advocated these views, annexing the West Bank. He published them in an article in 2017 before he was a cabinet member. It's called Bezalel Smotrich's decision plan, was published in 2017. Many Israelis, myself included, think that these are hallucinatory ideas because if Israel annexes the West Bank with its population, Israel would lose either its Jewish character or its democratic character. Because if you give them citizenship, then it would become a binational state. If you don't give them citizenship, it will become a non-democratic state. So I and many others think that this is a very bad idea. And we hope that it will not become government policy.
And just lastly, Ambassador, I mean, obviously decades of diplomacy have tried to bring about a Palestinian state. There obviously still isn't one. Do you think there ever will be?
A Palestinian state, in the full sense of the term, is not available around the corner because the Palestinian Authority, the entity that should become the government of the Palestinian state, is in bad shape. It's considered to be corrupt and inefficient. It needs to be overhauled. So if we designate an idea that we resume negotiations with the Palestinians with the notion of Palestinian statehood further down the road, I think this should satisfy the Arab world, Saudi Arabia included, and would be more realistic than expecting a Palestinian state around the corner, which is a pipe dream and not a reality.
Okay. Former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Itamar Rabinovich, thank you very much indeed for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's get some more reaction and analysis now. We can speak to Marc Polymeropoulos, who's a former senior intelligence officer for the CIA. Thanks so much for joining us, Marc. You spent years in the Middle East, 26 years precisely, covering Middle East, Europe, Eurasia, and counter-terrorism issues. Just like to pick your brains here and ask you what you think the US intelligence community, especially people in your orbit who know this region, the Middle East region, what they make of President Trump's plan to take over the Gaza Strip.
Well, it's good to be with you. I think probably the word to use is this is preposterous, or words to use, preposterous and also dangerous. I think this has probably given every CIA station chief in the Middle East a giant migraine headache. And frankly, I watched the events yesterday and I felt sorry for King Abdullah. I spent a lot of time in Jordan working with the Jordanian government. And this put Jordan, a key U.S. ally, in an impossible situation. I think Abdullah, while he was awkward, managed this quite deftly. He offered to take in 2,000 sick kids from Gaza, but he can never agree to this plan, which is, of course, akin to ethnically cleansing Palestinians, which is immoral in the first place, but also the ingest of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into Jordan would destabilize his kingdom. Those of us who know the Middle East remember 1970 and Black September, where King Abdullah's father, King Hussein, was battling the PLO at the time. And so this is really anathema to the Jordanian security services, certainly not in the interests of Jordan, a key U.S. ally. And I will also mention that for the United States, Jordan is what we call a lily pad for U.S. interests there. We work on counterterrorism issues, counterproliferation issues, and I'll say very clearly from U.S. intelligence, hundreds of Americans have been saved by the Jordanians, and they're a very capable security apparatus. So altogether, really kind of a migraine-inducing headache for intelligence personnel, U.S. intelligence personnel in the region.
Yeah, could this end up costing the United States some important allies in the Middle East region, this idea?
Well, I think King Abdullah, who of course does rely on over $1 billion in U.S. aid, has to really kind of be very careful on this. But he also, and the Jordanians also, if this goes through, would look to other sources of funding, whether it's the Saudis and then, God forbid, in the United States case, perhaps the Chinese. But I think there's something to be said also, even just the words that are being used. It's almost a calling card for Islamic extremists. When President Trump says things like owning Gaza, taking over Gaza, we have to remember that, and I was there for this, of course, the rise of al-Qaeda in the 90s was based on Osama bin Laden's critique of U.S. forces stationed in Saudi Arabia. And so this kind of inflammatory, triggering language that's being used, and I do think it's preposterous, but it doesn't matter. There could be second-order effects, and I'm sure that the U.S. and our allies in the counterterrorism world, our Arab allies in the region, are really monitoring terrorist cells or Islamic extremist forums. Is this a calling card for attacks against the United States and our allies as well? So I really think there's an effect on this, even, as you note, if this doesn't happen, but even with our allies and with certainly kind of U.S. and our allies' interests in the region.
What do you make of President Trump's understanding of the, in some cases, pretty complex dynamics of the Middle East region?
That's a great question, because I don't think, he has quite any really kind of historic understanding of it, and everything in the Middle East has to do with history. But number two, I also don't think he's listening to his advisors. I can't think of anyone from the State Department, from the CIA, my old organization, from the Department of Defense, and even some of our Arab allies, and of course the Israelis as well. No one would think this is a good idea, and so I don't think he listens. Obviously, there's this notion of real estate that he is so focused on. I think it probably comes from his background. Also, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, has talked about the Riviera in Gaza before. Perhaps he's influenced by the Israeli right as well. The Israeli right wing certainly has talked about, ethnically cleansing Gaza before. But for people who really know the region, I think they're not really getting through to him. And to me, that's a concern, because yesterday what we saw in the press conference, he didn't just double down, he tripled down on this idea, really in the face of significant global opposition. So I don't think he's listening.
You mentioned your former colleagues at the CIA, the State Department. Let's also think about the FBI as well. I mean, these are institutions of the United States that have kept the United States safe for decades, ever since those institutions were established. But morale in all of those institutions pretty low at the moment, isn't it? With, some pretty major changes afoot. At least that's what we've been given to understand by Elon Musk, for example. I mean, combined with what you've just been saying about the threat to US national security by these comments that have been issued by President Trump, I mean, how dangerous are things looking for the United States at this particular moment?
I do think we're at an inflection point, because while I think everyone who worked in government, and I certainly did, I could argue all day with you that we do need reform. There are things in the intelligence community, in the FBI, other parts of the US government that certainly are not efficient, that do need people to take a second look at it. But that's not what this is. This is taking a sledgehammer to national security institutions. And when you see these reports of potential purges in the FBI, 6,000 special agents potentially on the chopping block, or at my old institution, the CIA, where they're offering these early retirement. And in addition, sending names of kind of the junior officer cadre down to the Office of Management Budget for potential cuts. This makes no sense. This is decades of experience walking out the door, and the next generation also at risk. And, America is not going to be safe if we let talent depart. This is, again, not government reform. This is kind of eviscerating the civil service. The American people have always kind of complained at times that the government is too bloated, but I don't think this is what they want. And unfortunately, I think it's going to, if this does go through, it's going to take some really bad events to demonstrate that this was all a very poor exercise. So I am absolutely concerned about the national security ramifications of what seems to be not government reform, but really eviscerating key national security institutions.
Some of the people in President Trump's inner circle say that he's simply questioning conventional wisdom, and he's done this before, and he can claim to his credit he has achieved breakthroughs in the Middle East before, notably in the form of the Abraham Accords. Could we be misinterpreting? I mean, I think I know the answer to your question, but is there a glimmer of hope, or is there a glimmer of chance that we have misinterpreted the president, and this is simply a series of tactics, positioning, posturing, just to sort of gauge the temperature before making any decisions?
So, this is an argument that I hear from, many of my, friends in Republican circles, and my response to that is pretty clear. Look, there's always room for new and novel thinking. Those of us who have worked, for example, on the peace process for decades, there is some disillusionment that we haven't made progress. But kind of these ideas that President Trump throws out have these second order effects of doing what? Of destabilizing our allies in Jordan and in Egypt, of causing, as I just explained before, potential increase in terrorism threats to the United States when he talks about owning or taking over Muslim land. And so I'm all for new thinking. I'm all for new, fresh ideas, but you have to be really careful, and you would have to certainly listen to experts to say, well, hold on a second. If you say this, about kind of this forced removal of Palestinians from Gaza, this can really go south in a lot of ways. Even if you think that's just going to spur new thinking, there also could be some very damaging effects. So I understand when people say, hey, it's always good for new ideas, but you got to be really careful, particularly in this region, in what you put forth. And in this case, the idea of, in essence, the United States, advocating for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza. Remember, President Trump said they're not going to be welcome back. That, to me, is not new ideas to spur debate. That's really damaging.
One former senior FBI official by the name of Christopher O'Leary, who's got vast experience on counterterrorism, says that this kind of language being used by President Trump could prompt militants to start focusing on American nationals abroad. I mean, particularly he was talking about Palestinian militants. He says that's something that hasn't happened since the 70s and the 1980s. I mean, do you think that's a real risk now?
Well, I think it is a real risk, because we have to, remember that, what we've seen for decades, and one of the first operational desks I sat on at CIA was the Hamas desk in the mid 90s. And so what we've seen is Hamas, for example, has had traditionally a very capable fundraising apparatus globally. But we did not see, frankly, Hamas launching operations against, for example, Americans abroad. It would be very easy, in my view, that you would take this fundraising network and you operationalize it. Terrorist cells then can use these contacts and networks to launch attacks. And again, if we're talking about ethnically cleansing Palestinians, that's going to, I think, for a lot of right reasons, anger a lot of people in the Arab world. And the worst case scenario is that terrorist groups such as Hamas or perhaps Palestine Islamic Jihad or even others kind of piggyback on top of that and advocate for attacks on Americans. So even just this language I think is very inflammatory. And I would have liked to see, President Trump walk this back, but he doubled down on it yesterday. I can't imagine a U.S. official overseas dealing with our interlocutors in the Arab world having to explain why it's okay that the U.S. would, quote, own Gaza. And so I think it really is going to cause a headache for security officials, both U.S. intelligence, but also our friendly intelligence partners in the Middle East as well, because this is just going to inflame an already very, of course, precarious situation.
Yeah, obviously, and it's caused fury, it's caused a lot of confusion around the Middle East, and the frustration on the Jordanian king's face yesterday was palpable. I'm just wondering, whether President Trump understands the quandary he's put, for example, King Abdullah in, because he's got a domestic audience that he's obviously got to think about, but should be at the forefront of his mind, and the consequences of having more Palestinians coming to live in Jordan, which is a small country. There are already a large number living there. I mean, this could have real ramifications at a domestic level, and some saying this is an existential issue for Jordan. I mean, did that come across, do you think, to President Trump yesterday?
Again, I can't imagine that any of his advisors, I mean, they should be, are telling him this. This is a really bad idea. I don't think he listens. And I do think it's an existential crisis for the Jordanians. And as I said earlier, I felt terrible watching King Abdullah, who had to really kind of, dance through what was a very unpleasant press conference. Look, I even saw that I looked at the face of Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, and he looked pained in this because no one really thinks this is a very good idea. And in particular, there is really cause for concern that it would destabilize our allies, such, of course, as Jordan. But Trump doesn't seem to listen. There are very capable people in the U.S. government who would be putting forth the notion that this is not something that we should pursue. But President Trump, if you look at his career, is not one to back down. I can't explain to you why he is continuing on this notion that this is any kind of good idea, even if he thinks it's some type of smart move in negotiations. Because again, the immediate effects on the stability of Jordan, the immediate effects on the rise of terrorist threats against the United States and our allies, that is palpable right now. And I think it's a gigantic own goal for the U.S.
And just lastly, Marc, I mean, supposing President Trump does decide to change his mind and say, OK, this was not such a good idea, and in fact, it's not workable because without allies in the Middle East helping and delivering on their side of what he sees as a deal, it's just not going to see the light of day. But supposing he did backtrack, I mean, would you say the damage is done and that some of the things we've been talking about, the dangers, the threats that this could in turn pose to US national security, has the damage been done?
Well, that's a great question. And I think there is significant damage already, again, because you have emboldened kind of the Islamic extremist community. They would say, see, this is what the U.S. imperial ambitions are. And even if Trump backs down, we know what the U.S. ultimately wants to do. Of course, that's not correct. So I think there is some kind of long-standing damage. I think in terms of Jordan and Egypt, for example, look, both King Abdullah and then Sisi in Egypt could conceivably say, well, we came and we talked to President Trump and he backed down. So perhaps in the stability issues for Egypt and Jordan, there would not be long-standing damage. But in terms of the counterterrorism front, I do worry about that. And then really overall, just kind of the view of the United States as a reliable ally. I mean, this was kind of a hand grenade that was dropped into an already tense region. I guess that you could make you could certainly question is, will Trump do something like this again? So the U.S. as a reliable ally, I think a lot of our partners in the region will be questioning that.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Former Senior Intelligence Officer at the CIA, Marc Polymeropoulos. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, following on from that meeting at the White House between the US President Donald Trump and Jordan's King Abdullah, there was an exchange with reporters during which Al Arabia's Washington correspondent Nadia Bilbassi asked him whether his plans for relocating Palestinians from Gaza to other countries would constitute ethnic cleansing. Here's a clip of their exchange.
Mr. President, how do you know that the Palestinians don't want to leave their land? Some people say this is ethnic cleansing. You won't be able to force them to leave their land.
We're moving them to a beautiful location where they have new homes, where they can live safely, where they'll have doctors and medical and all of those things. And I think it's going to be great.
President Trump speaking there. Well, our next guest is the former First Minister of Scotland and current member of the Scottish Parliament, representing Glasgow Pollock. Humza Yousaf, thank you so much for joining us. People will remember your ordeal because your in-laws were, of course, trapped in Gaza for about a month at the start of the Israeli invasion. And during these last 16 months, you've become highly vocal on the situation. And you're, of course, the first Muslim leader of a Western democratic nation. So we really appreciate having you with us because I think we've got loads to talk about. And we're going to be talking about your family, their ordeal in Gaza in just a moment. But first, I just want to pick up on what we were just hearing there from President Trump, asked by our reporter last night about what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. She asked him if this constitutes ethnic cleansing. What are your thoughts?
Well, of course it does. It's the very textbook definition of ethnic cleansing. In fact, it's the dictionary definition of ethnic cleansing, to forcibly remove one group of people from their homes with the intent of replacing them with another is the very definition of ethnic cleansing. It's why, of course, Donald Trump chose not to answer your excellent reporter's question. And what we are seeing with the Trump presidency in particular is we are living, of course, in a time where we need the most serious of diplomacy, therefore the most serious of diplomats, the most serious of statesmen and women, the most serious of politicians, the most serious of heads of government and heads of state. And instead, in arguably the most powerful office in the entire world, we have a property tycoon. He's very good at real estate development, there's no doubt about it, but that's not the skill that we need. And I'm afraid he views everything, including the very complex situation in Israel and Palestine, and particularly at the moment within Gaza, as a real estate development opportunity. So call it whatever you like, talk about the Riviera of the Middle East as much as you like. I'm afraid it's ethnic cleansing, and everybody with a conscience, including every government with a conscience, should call it what it is.
Okay, what goes through your mind when you think that the ceasefire deal, which took months to negotiate, it only took effect on the 19th of January, could be on the brink of collapse?
I'm extremely worried. In fact, I'm devastated at the thought of the ceasefire breaking. It was always very fragile. We know that, of course. But why I'm so devastated and heartbroken at the thought of it is because it's not going to be militants, it's not going to be extremists, it's not going to be terrorists who suffer the consequences of, as Donald Trump put it, all hell breaking loose. It will be the innocent men, women and children of Gaza who had nothing to do with the attacks on October the 7th, 2023. They've never taken a single hostage in their lives. They're ordinary men, women and children who have suffered under occupation and oppression for many, many decades and are now possibly going to have to pay with their lives, as over 50,000 innocent Gazans have since October the 7th, 2023. So I'm extremely worried, and I hope that those who helped to broker the original ceasefire, predominantly Qatar and Egypt, along, of course, with the United States, I hope they can get Israel, Hamas back around that table to agree to the ceasefire, which of course should include the release of hostages. I've always condemned the taking of innocent people as hostages. But it should also, of course, make sure that Israel also abides by their part of the deal, including letting aid pour into Gaza, flood into Gaza, given the devastation that we're witnessing there.
And just turning now to some international reaction to all of these developments. The Scottish First Minister, John Swinney, who's a member of your party, has condemned President Trump's Gaza suggestions as, quote, completely unacceptable. Would you like to see him take that a little bit further, that condemnation?
He did. I mean, you've not read out the full quote. He called it ethnic cleansing, and I'm pleased he did, because there's so many leaders who refuse to call it what it is. They dance around the issue, they tiptoe around it, they beat around the bush, and they're too afraid to stand up and say what it is. And that wouldn't be the case, by the way, if it was Vladimir Putin who was saying that he expects to remove Ukrainians from Kiev, and he'll take them somewhere else, don't worry. Other Europeans can take them, maybe in Warsaw, maybe even in London, in Paris, and the capitals across Europe. But don't worry, I'll turn Kiev into a beautiful piece of real estate for people to enjoy. We would all quite rightly be not just condemning it, but calling it ethnic cleansing and demanding he get, if he carries out such a plan, gets held accountable for it. Why the difference, of course, when it is Gazans? Well, if the last 16 months have taught us anything, I'm afraid the stark reality is that Palestinian lives, Arab lives, I'm afraid are not equal to the lives of Europeans and those in the West. And that is entrenched, I'm afraid, in deep racism, systemic, institutionalized racism. And we should be standing up and calling it what it is.
And in terms of what the government down in London has been saying, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer in particular, I mean, what do you think of the kind of language that they've been using to describe the situation? And really as a follow-up to that question, do you get the impression perhaps they're a little bit scared of the Trump administration?
Well, it's complete cowardice, really. But it's worse than that from the United Kingdom government. Cowardice, is one thing. Complicity is a whole other. So we have a level of cowardice where Keir Starmer, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, they're unable and unwilling to call it what it is, i.e. ethnic cleansing. They're unwilling to take a robust and strong line because they're worried about what that would mean in terms of implication for the relationship, or the so-called special relationship, which only seems to be one way from where most of us observe. But the second thing is they are complicit. The United Kingdom government continues to supply arms to Israel, despite the fact, of course, the head of the Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu, is wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and has an arrest warrant out for him. So we don't just have cowardice, I'm afraid, from the United Kingdom government and many other governments, but focusing on the UK government, we have complicity.
Would you like to see the British government and Scottish senior figures following the example of, for example, Ireland, Norway and Spain, and officially recognising a Palestinian state? I mean, do you think that will ever happen?
The international recognition of the Palestinian state has to happen. And those countries that haven't done so, including, for example, the United Kingdom government, they are completely abdicating their responsibility to help with a meaningful peace process. So they're paying merely lip service to a two-state solution. You can't say that you agree with a two-state solution, but you only choose to recognize one state. You choose to recognize one side of the equation and leave blank the other side of the equation and wonder why you can't get a solution. And yes, the United Kingdom government should follow Ireland, Norway, Spain. The Scottish government doesn't have the powers to legally recognise a state. We've made it clear, of course, if we did have those powers, if we were an independent nation, or we were granted those powers through the current constitutional setup, then we would recognise a Palestinian state immediately, because it's the right and the moral thing to do.
You accused the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, of racism for meeting with an Israeli minister during the Gaza ceasefire negotiations. I just want to pick up on the word racist. Why that choice of word?
Well, I didn't specifically accuse David Lammy of that. What I said was the foreign policy, which says that we will treat white Europeans, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Europeans in one way when it comes to foreign policy, but treat Arabs, Palestinians, whether they're Christian or Muslim, in another way, is got to be rooted in racism. Let's just be honest with each other here. If almost 50,000 innocent Ukrainians, including 70% of those being women and children, had been killed, then there would have been a ceasefire a long time ago, and we certainly wouldn't be supplying arms to the opposing side. But, of course, with Gazans, with Palestinians, with Arabs, the situation is very different. Different rules apply. And that can only be rooted, I'm afraid, in racism. That's what it is. So, look, I'm never afraid to call these things out for what they are. And the sooner we do that, perhaps we can have a more honest conversation. Dear Lammy, somebody who's fought against racism, I know, his entire life, and very passionate about it, has been the subject of racism his entire life. This is not about the individual. This is about the institutions. And until we confront institutional racism within our governments, including the Scottish government, the United Kingdom government, governments across the world, then I'm afraid it's going to continue to happen.
Let's turn our attention across the Atlantic, because you've had this public feud with Elon Musk. And by the way, he's called you a, quote, super racist. I don't know what you think of that, but you've called him one of the most dangerous men on the planet. And now that we've had about 3 weeks to see him in action within the second Trump administration, I'm wondering if you stand by that assessment.
Well, everything I said about Elon Musk in summer last year has been proven to be true. I called him the most dangerous man on the planet, given he was using his billions to buy unfettered access to arguably the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States. He has now done that. And he's not done it for good purposes, but nefarious purposes. And not only that, of course, in the intervening period, we've had Elon Musk align himself with far-right white supremacists, like Tommy Robinson, who calls Islam a violent and fascist ideology. He's supported people like Geert Wilders from the Netherlands, who has called the Quran, compared it to Mein Kampf. He's called for mosques to be banned. He aligns himself with the AfD in Germany, the AfD who dedicated an entire chapter of their manifesto titled "Islam does not belong to Germany." So it was the legendary author Maya Angelou who said, when people show you who they are, you should believe them the first time. And Elon Musk, Nazi salute and all, has shown us time and time again who he is. It's about time we believed him.
So are you saying that Elon Musk is Islamophobic?
I'm saying that Elon Musk, not only is he Islamophobic, I think he is somebody who clearly has white supremacist, far-right sympathies. It's hard to make any other conclusion. Look, I was about to say to you, putting the Nazi salute to the side, look at all the other evidence, but what a way to start a sentence. What a way to start a sentence about somebody. Put the Nazi salute to the side. So that's the kind of person we're dealing with. And he shows no signs at all of pulling back. I think he is going to continue to use his enormous wealth, almost unlimited wealth, to not only influence elections, but remember, here in the United Kingdom, he's looking to overthrow a democratically elected prime minister. I might not agree with Keir Starmer on too many issues, including, of course, his stance on Israel, Gaza, but I have to respect the fact that he has a significant mandate to be prime minister, and nobody, certainly not somebody from another country, should be using their billions to try to overthrow him.
Yeah, and just picking up on that influence that he's got on the United Kingdom, I mean, do you see him succeeding in his goal? I mean, is he making traction, would you say, in terms of achieving that objective?
Of course he's making traction because he's extremely powerful and, of course, completely unaccountable. So he owns a platform, X, of course, which has, 650 million users, double the size of the United States population. So he has a huge platform which he owns, and he spreads disinformation. And, of course, admitted to that. He was in the Oval Office just yesterday, his office really, as opposed to Donald Trump's. Donald Trump was sitting there quietly like a good boy listening to the puppet master. And there was Elon Musk saying, he was questioned about his incorrect and inaccurate statement around 50 million US dollars going to Gaza in the Middle East. And of course, it turned out 50 million US dollars was not going to Gaza in the Middle East. It was going to a place called Gaza in, I think, Mozambique. And he said, oh, look, at times I do make inaccurate and incorrect statements. And then I go to correct them. Well, you didn't correct that statement is the entire point. What Elon Musk does is he is the cheerleader in chief when it comes to spreading disinformation. And by the time, if he corrects that information, which he really does, but if he does, then I'm afraid the consequences have already been felt, usually by minority communities. And that was the same here in Southport in the United Kingdom, where he amplified and spread disinformation. And we ended up in the summer seeing mosques having bricks thrown through the windows, people of colour and Muslims targeted in the street, and a hotel full of vulnerable asylum seekers almost set on fire.
So just before we move on from talking about the world's richest man, I mean, what are your sort of thoughts to sort of summarize this chapter of our discussion? Do you have a warning? Could you explain to us the degree to which you're concerned about where things might head to from here?
In my view, the rise of the far right, which is driven by predominantly anti-Muslim hatred, whether it's the National Front in France, the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, AFD in Germany, whether it's parties like Reform here in the United Kingdom, driven by anti-Muslim hatred, anti-migrant hatred. If we continue to allow this rising tide of the far right to continue, if we don't challenge it and don't confront it, if we don't confront those who support it, influence it, amplify it, like Elon Musk, then I think Western democracy is under threat of complete collapse. Because how on earth can we have true democracy when oligarchs like Elon Musk can buy elections? How can we have a democracy when the world's richest man, through his money, wealth, platforms, influence, can overthrow or attempt to overthrow democratically elected heads of government? So I think the rise of the far right, amplified by Elon Musk, is, if not the biggest threat, one of the biggest threats to Western democracy.
Now, talking more specifically about you and your own story, you're the son of people of Pakistani heritage from the Punjab. You've suggested, and I think you've been saying this as we've been going along in this conversation, that Islamophobia is a growing problem in not just Scotland, the United Kingdom as a whole. You've also been quoted as saying that that sentiment, that sort of undercurrent, could drive you and your daughters away from the United Kingdom. I just want to pick up on that. I mean, is that correct? And are you thinking of leaving?
Look, I don't want to leave Scotland. I'm talking to you from Scotland. It's my home. It's where I'm raising, my wife and I are raising our three beautiful daughters. It's the country I was born in, educated in, and of course it's the country I had the great privilege of serving in various ministerial portfolios, as well as, of course, leading as the First Minister of the country. So you can cut me in half and I'll bleed blue of Scotland. So that Scotland is my heart. It's in my heart. It's my home. So I would never want to leave Scotland. But if I go back to those Southport riots, I never thought I'd live in an era or a time where we would have bricks thrown through the windows of mosques, violence that targets Muslims, specifically looking for Muslims to target. And therefore, my first responsibility, not as a former First Minister or as a Member of Parliament, as you gave me in my introduction, my first and foremost responsibility is as a father. And could I honestly say, given the rising tide of the far right across Europe, including here in the United Kingdom, driven by anti-Muslim hatred, that my daughters, who proudly will be proudly Muslim, my 15-year-old wears her identity proudly, and so she should. Can I say that she would be safe and they would be safe in this country? I think the answer to that is, well, at the very best, I'm not sure. And therefore, if I have to take steps to protect my children, of course I would do that. So look, I don't have any plans to leave. I wouldn't want to leave. But of course, I'm deeply worried about the safety of my children. I hope every other parent that's watching this or listening to this could understand that fear.
One of the other things you're quoted as having said is that 9/11 changed your life. And if I've done my mathematics right, you were 16 at the time of 9/11. You were at secondary school in Glasgow. I'm just wondering what it changed for you.
I mean, so much. I was your kind of typical Glaswegian 16-year-old. I was in love with my football team, still am. Glasgow Celtic, who are playing, I should say, tonight on playing on Wednesday. That was pretty much all I thought about. I thought if I wasn't playing football, I was talking about football. If I wasn't talking about football, I was watching football. So I was your typical Glasgow, west of Scotland teenage boy. Of course, I'd encountered racism before 9/11. And then quite literally overnight, things changed. I remember going into my morning form class or registration class the day after 9/11. So 9/11 was on a Tuesday, going on the Wednesday morning and sitting next to my friends, who were the same two boys I sat beside, all year. And they, instead of talking about football, all the other things that teenage boys talk about, they started bombarding me with questions around 9/11. Do you know who did it? Who is it that flew those planes into the Twin Towers? Why is it Muslims hate America? And they weren't in any way, by the way, being malicious. They genuinely thought, as a Muslim, I must know the answer. So from that day, or that night onwards, I watched the news for the first time. I never used to watch the news until the sports results came on. That night, I chose to watch the news from start to finish with my dad, and I became hooked. But it was also the day that we went from people being targeted for the colour of their skin, which of course still happens, but for most Muslims it went from the targeting of the colour of the skin to suddenly being abused because of your faith. And I'd never been called a terrorist or a jihadist or an extremist or a fundamentalist or had my loyalty questioned until 9/11 happened. And since then, of course, many other things, geopolitical events have taken place, and all of them, of course, many of them, I should say, have been exploited in order to further anti-Muslim hatred by generalizing that Muslims must sympathize or in some way even be involved in such atrocities when, of course, the vast overwhelming majority of Muslims, the 2 billion or so that are across the world, live peaceful lives and want peace for themselves and the communities they live in.
And of course, geopolitics and events, a long way from Scotland have had a very direct impact on your life in recent months and years. And we were talking at the beginning about how your parents-in-law were trapped in Gaza for 4 weeks at the start of the Israeli invasion. Just want to ask you, how is your family doing?
I'm grateful that you asked. I mean, my mother-in-law and father-in-law, I think, are going to live with the trauma of those 4 weeks for the rest of their lives. I don't think they'll ever be the same people again. Most of my wife, Nadia's family, have managed to leave Gaza, but she still has some family. She was recently talking to her cousin, who has 4 young children. She has a husband and 4 young children. She's originally from the north of Gaza, Nadia's cousin, but has not returned to the north because she's been told there's no point in making the long, arduous journey because the house she had has been completely decimated and turned into rubble. The condition of the children and of Nadia's cousin, I mean, they are emaciated, they are malnourished, they're desperate for food, desperate for water, medicine. It's just the basics, not anything extravagant, just the basics. And it's a miserable situation. I mean, we've run out of words. I mean, your news channel will be running the scenes for the last 16 months. It is, as Donald Trump called it himself, it's hell on earth. The difference is, of course, Donald Trump was sitting next to the man who's made it hell on earth. And the rest of us now have a responsibility in terms of the international community to get that ceasefire back on track so we can continue to flood Gaza with as much aid as possible to help the innocent people who had nothing to do with the atrocious attacks that we saw on the 7th of October 2023.
Yeah, and of course, what do you think your relatives, the ones who've been so directly impacted by what's happened in Gaza, make of these plans for a so-called Riviera or whatever President Trump said it was going to be? How do they digest comments like that?
Well, I think we can almost universally agree that the people of Gaza are the most resilient and strongest that I've ever witnessed in my whole life. They have gone through the most horrendous atrocities, losing their children, entire families being wiped out, all of their infrastructure damaged or destroyed, schools, hospitals, water infrastructure. Yet you saw them in their, if not hundreds of thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, making their way back up to not even their homes, sometimes the rubble that's left of their homes in North Gaza. They're incredibly resilient people, but they are, for all the travesty that they've been through, the atrocities that they've been through, every Gazan to a man and woman will say, we don't want to leave our land. Nadia's family were the same. They simply didn't want to leave. Some of them, of course, have left, and who could begrudge them the opportunity to do so, particularly those with young children. But many of them are saying, we simply just will not leave. And, I think about it, I try to put myself in their shoes. If somebody came to me and said, we're going to take your land off you, your home, as I said, I'm as Scottish as they can be. We're going to take your home in Scotland. And don't worry, you'll get a beautiful piece of land in Mauritius, those wonderful white sandy beaches. But look, we're just going to, you're not really got a choice. We're just going to take your land and we're going to give it to somebody else. Or we're just going to take it. I would tell them where to go. And, it is absolutely right that Gaza continues to belong to the people of Gaza. And I think the Arab nations have a big responsibility to make it abundantly clear, loud and clear, that they simply will not stand for the ethnic cleansing of the people of Palestine.
Okay, and just lastly, you were the first minister of color, the first Muslim leader of a Western democratic nation. You've stepped back, obviously, from being first minister. It's been reported you're going to stand down as an MSP, but you're not even 40 years old. Just lastly, this cannot be the end of your career. What are you going to do now?
I'm hurtling towards 40, I should say. I've got a couple of months in my 30s left. But look, I would certainly take a step back from party politics. But what I'd be keen to do is continue to use the expertise and skills that I've gained, what to do, what not to do, to try to help with some of the most pressing challenges our world faces. And that includes conflict. We have far too much conflict in the world, and we've talked about just Gaza, and if you think about all the other conflict that exists across the world, if I can use those skills in conflict resolution, but also in tackling the rising threat of the far right, those are the kind of areas that I'm interested in. But look, I've still got over a year to make sure I continue to represent the wonderful constituents in Glasgow Pollock who deserve my attention and certainly have my attention, and I take their trust as a very serious one. So look, nothing lined up as of yet, and I'm sure those conversations will take place over the course of the next year and a bit.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for your time. We really appreciate it. Former First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure talking to you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.